And it's Friday night with Byline Times. I'm Peter Jukes.
And I'm Hardeep Matharu, and over the next hour we'll bring you what the papers don't say.
And what the TV doesn't tell you. Now, TV isn't all bad. And we'll be looking back to the early days of television, a celebration of some of the good sides of media. But after that, we'll be looking at something darker and what's happened on social media. Last week, we talked about Kate Shiromani, and we have an exclusive clip of an interview with her son, Sebastian Shiromani, and what it's like living with somebody who believes in conspiracy theories.
Boris Johnson's latest joke about the closure of mining pits under Thatcher being actually good for climate change has caused outrage, but he has refused to apologise. Where did all the good chaps in Britain go? We'll be talking to Gavin Esler to find out why our British constitutional system is outdated. Then we'll be joined on the blue sofa by Zarina Zabrisky, and we'll be talking about the continuing suppression of dissent in Putin's Russia and threats to freedom in Belarus. And then finally, we'll be speaking to former MP Tom Brake, who now leads Unlocked Democracy, about what we can learn from threats to democracy abroad here at home.
But a pretty discombobulating week, don't you think, Hardeep? And our front page slightly reflects that, if we look at our front page, and that's a creaking constitution, a bit disheartening in some ways, I'd say, our front page.
Well, like you have coined this theme, haven't you, Peter?
What?
We like to look at when the volcanoes erupt, but we also like to look at the fault lines so we can determine what's actually going on. And again, really this focus on our constitutional system, which we'll be exploring with Gavin and Thomas to an extent later on, is, you know, we can't keep being surprised when another minister doesn't resign, when there's another scandal and there's a complete lack of accountability. There must be something deeper going on. And really this is a theme we pick up on in this month's print edition, which we've been working on this week.
With Gavin Esler, who's written our lead today, Robert Murphy, Chris Gray, Robert Saunders. We have some great writers and academics talking about they also see this creaking constitution. But we can only do this and do this TV show with your help. So thank you for all your great support. You've been very, very supportive in the last almost a year we've been doing this. We've almost come to break even. And to keep us going, if you can, do sign up at patreon.com/Byline TV or on our YouTube channels. We want to grow, we want to get bigger than GB News, and we don't have any hedge funds or advertisers to boycott us. So please support us if you can. And on a lighter note, let's look back to actually a film released this week by the BBC from 1977, 45 years ago, where somebody celebrates the first 17, 18 years or maybe 20 years of television and the effect it had on her life. Let's just listen to this woman who talks in 1977 about the eighth wonder of the world.
For people of my background, you know, very poor East End people, it was a phenomenon. I mean, we couldn't afford a motor car, it was out of the question. Television, refrigerator was an unnecessary luxury. We all had all our milk floated in water and butter, it didn't matter. But television, oh, it was like the eighth wonder of the world. For a few pounds there and so much a month, we was able to obtain perhaps a 12-inch set. And of course, in those days, it was a sort of social status. The old aerial had to go on the roof in those days. It wasn't just down below. And of course, there were some people in the East End, you know how they are, that were putting aerials on their roof and nothing on the other end. But that, I never really knew anybody like that. But of course, it was a wonderful thing for us. I mean, we were big families, and we'd all get together. It actually brought us all back together again. And then there was the clamour of all the time, and that was going to destroy the art of conversation. Well, what we were talking about before we had television, I don't know. It was the conversation on the bus, the station, everybody. What did you see? It was BBC only in them days. And of course, some of the programmes were a little bit above our head. They were a little bit highbrow, slightly middle class, you know, they play. We didn't really mind that because it was a fantasy. We got away from that kitchen sink. And it made us feel that we was escaping from that kitchen sink. It was so new, I think some of the highbrow programmes like the ballet and things like that, we accepted them and we didn't sort of shut off because it aroused our curiosity.
So, I mean, you know, I was born in 1960, and I remember my parents were worried because I was goggle-eyed. I used to sit in front of the television all through my youth. I can remember Batman, I can remember all the cartoons and all the TV shows. And the fear then was that television would create these horrible antisocial people. And as that wonderful lady said, you know, it would kill conversation. But, you know, we had Morecambe and Wise, we all talked about the TV shows. In a way, it was a national conversation. Is that different now in that there isn't one conversation? You don't have, except for maybe Line of Duty, you know, 20 million people tuning in to watch the same show.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much diversification now, and it's incredible to think how far we've come from, you know, that lady describes this was such a new thing, and this radically transformed people's personal and social lives, their family lives, how they spent their time. And now there are so many different options, but the medium of television, I mean, it's so powerful. I remember learning so much as a kid, actually. I mean, goggle-eyed like you, but actually I still say I learned so much from watching sitcoms and comedies and soaps, Peter, you won't be happy to hear. But so, for example, you know, even today, I think EastEnders has just been featuring a Sikh family, and a Punjabi Sikh family, which I really relate to. And I've never seen it done on television, all the dynamics that go on. It's really done really well, and there's so much more representation. I think that power to reach millions of people is still there. But I think what's happened now is it's sort of that medium has, you know, inevitably become used for ends which are also not so great.
Well, I mean, the interesting thing is, except for football, we all now have our own little stream channels. It's all Me TV, not national. It's a MeCast, it's narrowcast. And I mean, that takes on to the next subject, really, the dangers of narrowcasting. Now, you may remember last week and a year ago, we interviewed Kate Shomani, this now struck-off nurse, who claimed that, you know, COVID was a scam, that to avoid the vaccine. And some very troubling remarks about NHS staff, you know, being sent for Nuremberg trials. But more interesting still is talking to her son, Sebastian Shomani. He joined us earlier today, and this is just a short interview from a longer film we're making with him about what it's like living with somebody who's a conspiracy theorist and what impact that had on his life.
At the Nuremberg trials, the doctors and nurses stood trial, and they hung! If you are a doctor or a nurse, now is the time to get off that bus!
My name is Sebastian Shomani, and my mum is one of the UK's biggest COVID-19 conspiracy theorists. I sincerely don't think anyone could have stopped my mum from going down this route. The reason being that, alongside her beliefs in conspiracy theories, she personally is extremely arrogant and narcissistic. That's the feedback that anyone will give you if you talk to her for more than 15 minutes. And when someone has that level of self-belief, an unhealthy level of self-belief, they're never going to listen to anyone else when someone says you're wrong. And there have been times when I've said to her, "You're wrong about something," and she will say either that I was stupid or that I'm arrogant. She'll often project onto me. Or another interesting thing that everybody does when they believe in conspiracies, so this is not just my mum now, is the more you argue with them, the more they see you as evidence that their worldview is correct. So this is why conspiracies aren't like ordinary ideas and hypotheses that people have in society, because evidence of them being incorrect is taken by believers as evidence that those believers are right. So if I would argue with my mum, it was because I'd been brainwashed by the school that I went to, and therefore she's still correct. So how can you argue with somebody when every good point you make, the better the point is, it means the more correct they are? It's impossible. So there's nothing that could stop that process. My mum can set herself up as the alternative. So if you see the way that she preaches at her rallies, she sees herself as a messiah. People come to see her as the only source of truth because they're scared. They believe in her credentials, and they already don't trust their government, which is the mainstream source. But from there, it very quickly escalated to there are dark, shadowy forces at play that have inhabited the bodies of the royal family and the rich and famous, and they want to genocide all of us, etc. So it was an escalation. The way they get to that extremism is they first find a little idea that sounds very reasonable. all of a sudden you start finding alternative explanations for bigger and bigger things. Some people are a complete write-off. My mum is an example of that. I've had some very sad, honestly, really quite stressful messages from people who are reaching out to me for help. And some of them, you can see that there's hope, and some of them you can see there really is no hope. And those people, I think, just in the same way you deal with a bad breakup, you cut them out of your life, you realise that that person is no longer there. I stopped going home to see my mum when I was 17. From what I know, she's been very socially isolated and not had anyone visiting her really for about 2 years. So I think she's just been by herself on the internet all day. And this is another thing that happens with conspiracy theorists. The more extreme they get, the more people they push away, so the fewer sources of reality they have to challenge them. So you can see how it can spiral very, very quickly out of control. The fact that there are online communities around to make people feel like they aren't alone in rejecting the mainstream, but rather they're joining a big alternative contingent, that psychologically, I mean, it's got to be the same as, you know, your football player in the stadium's cheering for you, right? So for my mum, she's surrounded by yes men. She's not going to change her mind.
Well, first, can I just thank Ryan McCourt, who's just become a member. And I want to say on YouTube, if you sign up now on YouTube or on Patreon, you can ask us questions after the show and our special Q&A for members only. But back to that Sebastian Sheremani short clip of a longer film we're making. It really does quite disturb me how, you know, we've dealt a lot on Byline Times with disinformation and misinformation online. But to hear the personal consequences, that isolation, I think we forget the real human cost of this, Hardeep, don't you think?
Yeah, and it's really been interesting in the last week. We've had numerous stories coming up in the mainstream media about people who have sadly died from COVID-19, having not had the vaccination and actually expressing regret before they died, saying that they wish they had had it. And I think it's so important that those stories are being told because, you know, it may just be a minority, but the thing with vaccination or herd immunity through vaccination is that it does require a majority of people to get it. So actually this isn't just about personal choice, it affects others. And it's been interesting as well, just further afield, Jennifer Aniston, the Hollywood actress and Friends star, has said on Instagram this week that because of certain people in her social circle not having the vaccination, she's had to sort of remove them from her daily cycle of socializing. And the comment provoked quite a response from some of her fans who asked her to elaborate on why she was cutting people out. And she was saying it's not that I want to cut people out, and it's not about me, you know, but if someone's got the variant of the coronavirus, they can still spread that. And I might not end up in hospital, she said, because I've had the jabs, but I could then pass it on to someone who's much more vulnerable, who could die. And so it was really interesting to see, you know, much more high-profile discussion of this phenomena. And she was specifically talking about anti-vaxxers, which, of course, is what Kate Sheremani was in Trafalgar Square a couple of weeks ago, also advocating for.
It's very odd. This dialogue seems to go backwards. Everybody now understands why I cannot smoke in this room with you without your permission or in a public place, because it affects my freedom of choice, the limits of your freedom. And I am surprised if you see what's happening on Fox News in America, one of the big advocates of, oh, don't take the vaccine, it could hurt your kids. Everybody who works there has to have the vaccine. In fact, I believe, I can't establish this for a fact, but I've heard that even GB News, which has a lot of sort of COVID skeptics and anti-vaxxer people on it, requires you to have a certificate of vaccination or a recent test to go in there.
Yeah, and we've had quite an interesting piece. Again, it's on our digital front page, but it'll also be in our print edition, by Tom Burt, the environmentalist. And he was actually looking at some of these more philosophical questions, this kind of freedom to and freedom from that is raised by this thing about anti-vaccination, anti-lockdown versus people who would rather be more cautious to protect everybody. Tom Burt was making the point this week in Byline Times that these questions are also very, very relevant to the climate change discussions and the choices ahead. And I just think it's always interesting that actually scaling back, there are some really interesting philosophical points here.
But also the same money
become more relevant
behind COVID Denialism.
Exactly.
Climate change. And just to close this sequence, here's a rather distressing clip of someone who didn't take the vaccine because they believed in these conspiracy theories, now urging people to take it.
I messed up big time, guys. I didn't get the vaccine.
Coming up, we'll be talking to Zarina Zabrisky about the situation in Russia and Belarus, and talking to Tom Brake about how the threats to democracy there have impacts for us here in the UK.
But first, let's have a look at the good chap's theory of British government. Now, this week, Boris Johnson told what was, he claims, another joke when he visited Scotland. This time he was saying that the closure of mining pits during Margaret Thatcher's tenure was actually good for climate change. Now, it's a comment that provoked outrage from people in the communities that were decimated as a result, and even his own Conservative MPs have criticised the comments. And now, while he said that he recognised the devastation that the closure of the pits caused, he was standing by his comments. So Boris Johnson won't be apologising, and yet, is that really something new? What has happened to accountability in this country, and what are some of the deeper reasons why all the good chaps seem to have walked out of our political system? Well, now we're joined by Gavin Esler, who's a journalist and author. His latest book is called How Britain Ends, which explores some of these issues. And he wrote about the good chap mode of politics in Britain for Byline Times this week. Gavin, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Hardeep. It's a pleasure.
So could you explain to our viewers what are some of these deeper structural problems that we have to contend with? You know, we're constantly surprised when a minister doesn't resign, when there's another scandal of incompetence bordering on corruption or both. And, you know, with the exception of Matt Hancock recently, the new norm seems to be a lack of accountability. But, you know, what really explains this?
Well, I should say first that friends of mine in Scotland are saying Boris Johnson is always welcome in Scotland for those who want an independent Scotland, because his kind of comments just, I know from Conservatives in Scotland, they think they put their head in their hands and can't believe it. And people who are in favour of independence are somewhat cheered up by his bloviating. The good chap theory of government comes from something that Peter Hennessy, an academic and a great writer, wrote many years ago, where he suggested that, I suppose, the complacency that we have in Britain about our political structure is sort of based on the idea that they're all good chaps. Of course, Hardeep, they would all be chaps, and they know their place and they know the limits of what they do. And that certainly, to an extent, I'm not being rosy about the past, seemed to apply when Lord Carrington resigned over the Falklands invasion, which wasn't his fault, and everybody knew it wasn't his fault, but he thought somebody should be responsible. And it happens with judges and others. Well, Peter Hennessy and one of his co-authors on some other work, Dr. Blick, suggested that maybe the good chap theory has died. And it's died because people don't show restraint. They don't seem to know where the boundaries are. And our complacency about this means that what are the rules? And just to give you one example, we knew what the rules were in America when the president of the United States got COVID. It meant the vice president kind of did the job. When the prime minister of our country got sick, who was the good chap who would replace him? We don't have a structure. And we ended up with Dominic Raab, and people said, well, what can he do? Could he declare war on Russia? Nobody seemed to know. So we have a degree of complacency, which means that some people can thrive. And I've been talking about the book festivals all around the country, and the number of people who ask in literary festivals and elsewhere, ask, why have we got into this mess? And one of the reasons is to do with that complacency.
And one of the most striking examples I thought of this recently was when Dawn Butler was asked to leave the House of Commons recently, because that was a case of a convention being enforced, but against her, and inadvertently protecting the Prime Minister, who she was accusing of lying. So in that case, you're not allowed, MPs are not allowed in the House of Commons to call other MPs liars. And so it was bizarre that through trying to enforce this convention, which is about facilitating honour, Dawn Butler was made to leave, and yet Boris Johnson has never corrected on the record in the Commons at all his many misleading statements.
Yes, absolutely. Look, we've got a political system which was invented in the era of the horse and cart, and we think it's brilliant. Well, it's the envy of the world. It simply isn't. You know, there's no other country in the world that's got 800 unelected people in the House of Lords, although you could say the Chinese Communist Party have made a reasonable fist of it with about 800 people in one of their kind of administrative places. We have also got a political system which was invented essentially for two parties, except we don't have two parties. You know, the biggest party in Scotland is the SNP, the biggest party in Northern Ireland is the DUP, the biggest party in Wales is Labour, and the biggest party in England is the Conservative Party. So and also we have a series of governments that are elected, as Boris Johnson has been, with a thumping majority in the House of Commons on 43.6% of the vote. Now, I know people have tried to correct this in the past, and we've tried to have a sensible discussion about proportional representation. The problem is we know what the problem is, but discussing constitutional matters can turn people off because it's quite boring to people who've got other more important things in their lives, frankly.
Gavin, can I throw in another element here? And I'm not accusing you of anything, but you have a very esteemed career as a journalist. You can look over that world a little bit for us. And Robert Saunders, who actually has written something for us on Byline Times this week, also wrote for Prospect. And he had this sort of slightly, very similar to your theory, but he said before there were bad chaps and they were forced to resign mainly because of uproar in the media and the public. Do you think the Fourth Estate is also a dysfunctional wheel on this system, this mechanism that's breaking down?
I think absolutely that is the case. Look, if you have got a number of newspapers which do set the political agenda, owned by people who are not resident for tax purposes, you're going to have newspaper coverage which is beneficial to those who are not resident for tax purposes. The other 65, 67 million of us are in a slightly different place. And also what happens is that not just the agenda is set, but they swallow, absolute cobblers sometimes. I was astonished when David Frost, now Lord Frost, the person who negotiated the Brexit deal, which he said was excellent, 6 months later, he now seems to think the word he meant was excrement because he doesn't like it. But when he appeared in Brussels in 2019, he gave this speech which was treated as if it was a heavyweight treatise from a prominent academic, where he said, well, you see, we don't really get on with Europe because you've kind of invented things where we've just evolved. That's utter rubbish. We didn't just evolve in 1921 when 22% of the landmass of the United Kingdom, known as Ireland, with 26 counties of Ireland, seceded. We have gone through a series of struggles as a nation and crises as a nation. We haven't just evolved. And so the kind of coverage which is given to people talking nonsense and people talking lies, to return to Hardeep's point, is quite extraordinary. And so when Dawn Butler calls it out, everybody knows the Prime Minister lies repeatedly, but nobody does anything about it.
Well, Gavin, thank you for joining us this evening, and hopefully we can talk again in the future and build on some of these points that we can actually put into action to perhaps change the unwritten constitution and get people more interested in it. But it is certainly a challenge, but it's great that you're writing about it and speaking about it, and let's discuss it again soon. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
So, we have constitutional problems here, but what about abroad? So we're still waiting for Zarina, I think, to join us any moment now. But she has done this film she has given us an edited film from one of Navalny's doctor. Alexei Navalny, now in prison, as you may know, for having broken some obscure rule, having fled the country, having been poisoned, it appears, by Novichok. He was the opposition leader, one of the few opposition leaders really to survive Putin's Russia after his 20-something year rule. And here we have a very short clip of his doctor, who is Navalny's doctor, who is in imminent threat of getting arrested herself.
Navalny helped me to develop our trade union. I have met him in 2017 when someone pushed in his eye acid. The damage of the eye was really very serious. He really can lose his eye. And say Navalny helped my mother to return to the work with the judge and with his lawyers. Then I understood that a lot of medical workers all over Russia had similar problems. I decided to make the trade union of medical workers, and Alexei helped me. He was poisoned in the prison. It's a really very terrible situation. I and my colleagues understood that that was the real attempt to kill him with a chemical substance. He has a real pain, terrible pain, but they said it's okay to have an opportunity to be treated in the hospital. Putin understands that he is not very popular in Russia now, and his popularity is really decreasing. And they don't want me and Alexei Navalny and his people to change country. Putin and his officials, they are really very, very strong. They had a lot of money, a lot of power in their hands. But the hope should be in our hearts, in our minds. But a lot of people in Russia, they are afraid, and because they all have children and parents and just want to live, not to be in prison, but to live. I really love my country, and I really love the people. I really want very, very much to make them happy and to give them such things that Putin and his officials have stolen. I'm living here. I will fight until I'm alive. And I hope that in some time, maybe we will change the country.
I'm delighted to be joined by Zarina Zabrisky, who conducted that interview with Anastasia Vasilyeva. Can you tell me how you came to get that interview and what's going on from your perspective as a US citizen for 15 years, but you still live in Russia? What's happening in Putin's Russia after this amazing outburst of apparent protest a few months ago and then this clampdown?
Right. Thank you, Peter. And there's so much going on, as you know. Anastasia Vasilyeva is Navalny's personal doctor, and she's been following him during the last, 4 years of his journey, helping him throughout multiple poisoning. We did bring a clip of her playing Beethoven while her apartment was being searched here on the Byline, and that was around January, I believe. And ever since, I've been talking to people in her direct environment and following her deal, because she's been basically confined to her house, just as most prominent leaders of the opposition in Russia. There's a so-called sanitary case in which 10 prominent opposition leaders, including Navalny's brother Oleg Navalny, his press secretary Kira Yarmysh, former Pussy Riot members, say Maria Alokhina, who you probably know, and many others. Actually, there are 10 all in all. People being held under the parole-like sentence sentence. It's called restricted freedom, when they can only leave their apartments at a certain time during the day, and they must be back by a certain hour, and if they violate by minute, they can actually face the prison sentence.
It's like a house arrest.
Exactly.
With a bit of license to go out. And how long are they allowed out for? Like an hour or something?
That depends on a person. Usually they could be out during the day, but there are multiple and complicated rules. And so Anastasia Vasilyeva is facing her trial and hearing on Wednesday, this coming Wednesday, where she might, in fact, face the actual prison sentence because she was caught a couple of minutes late while trying to help Navalny when he was on the hunger strike in April, in May, along with her colleagues and other doctors. They were trying to break through into prison while he was protesting his health.
So it's kind of like a judicial form of torture and oppression. Can you just update us on the status of Alexei Navalny? He went on hunger strike. He's now given that. He was very ill, had pneumonia or something. Is he in good health? Is he being well treated?
Well, according to Anastasia, actually, he's feeling better now because the doctors asked him to stop the hunger strike at the time. His health was really in danger, and he was placed in the hospital, and now he's back just being in prison. Meanwhile, his organization is being under extreme pressure. The Anti-Corruption Fund has been given the status of a terrorist organization, and the members of the fund are not allowed to run for the election.
Can you just explain? So the Navalny's fund, as we saw in this amazing movie, which I recommend anybody to watch, about Putin's palace, is an anti-corruption organization. They've been designated a terrorist organization.
Right, right.
So you have some experience of this, Zarina, because are you not also designated a terrorist?
Well, more or less. That was not as dangerous as the situation for the Russian opposition members.
You can't go back to Russia now because you are...
I can't, because with the Arts Resistance Collective back in San Francisco, we were protesting in front of the Russian Federation consulate in San Francisco when it was still there, and they called the FBI on me, complaining that I was a terrorist act. Yeah.
So what's your reading? You know, we saw these amazing protests and the clampdown, as you say, they're taking apart the organization, taking their funds, independent media, independent journalists. Is this working well? And are they learning a lesson from what's happened in Belarus? And we'll see in a moment the athlete who's defected from Belarus. Are Lukashenko and Putin's looking at each other as models of oppression and kind of learning from each other?
You know, a lot of people are under the impression that it's happening, including Anastasia Vasilyeva, who told me that in the interview yesterday, that who knows, maybe it's Putin learning from Lukashenko, and I believe so, because the protests in Belarus have been going from the 6th of August of 2020, when Svetlana Tikhanovskaya was elected democratically.
He annulled the election and he fixed the result, and Lukashenko is still in power.
Exactly, and it's been a year, and the Belarusian people, courageous as they are, were protesting every weekend, facing torture, prison, beatings, really horrible things. I'm talking to people from Belarus, and reports are just horrific. A lot of people are trying now to escape, but even when they're abroad, they're not finding peace or safety. Just a couple of days ago, Vitaly Shishov was found hanging on the tree in Kiev.
Explain who he was.
He was a young man, sadly, of 26 years old, and he was helping other Belarusian refugees to escape Lukashenko's regime. And although there is an official version that it could have been a suicide, the Belarusian community in Kiev, I heard from sources, my sources there, is convinced that this is Belarusian security services job.
And they could operate in Ukraine as Russian services.
Oh, of course, they could operate here, as we know.
Well, as we know, there was Novichok in our streets and polonium in our restaurants.
And that is the problem, and that's when we think that this is actually something that is happening Far East, and we shouldn't really be that concerned here. This is not entirely true. The world is very small, and there are ways of getting the situation across the border. Yeah. And speaking of the border, we might as well mention the crisis at Lithuanian border, Lithuania being a part of the EU. We know now that Lukashenko has invited Iraqi people in a so-called vaccine tourism to get vaccinated in Minsk in Belarus. And when they arrive to Belarus, they've been offered a transfer by tourist agencies for the $400 or $1,000. They are being offered to get transferred to Lithuania in order to get to the EU.
So they're doing a kind of people trafficking, and a little bit as what happened in 2015, particularly with Syrian refugees, weaponizing migration.
And here we see how one dictator is learning from another dictator, and how it is really contagious and spreading through Europe, because it's a problem for Lithuania, which is a relatively small country that doesn't have a physical border with Belarus. There's just deep forest. And so there are the helicopter shots on which we see that the Belarusian border control vehicles are bringing these people to the Lithuanian border.
So what we need to do is send Nigel Farage out there, and he can do something about it. Sorry, Hardeep.
I was going to say, Zarina, you've written for Byline Times over the past 2 years, really amazingly, about the hybrid warfare that under Putin, Russia has been engaging with in terms of how it sees itself and its enemies abroad. And the principal way in which this has been explored, and you've explored it, is through disinformation and, big tech and harnessing everything. I mean, what's happening now? Has there been a shift since, the presidential election was won by Joe Biden and things have sort of shifted geopolitically? Has Putin sort of changed tact as well? Is the hybrid warfare still going on, or is...
Putin does not change his strategy or his course. The hybrid war is very much on. It's a great question.
Is it evolved?
It is constantly evolving because the Kremlin is investing the money stolen from the Russian people into the hybrid war to expand their influence. And this is exactly what Navalny and his anti-corruption fund is trying to fight. This is actually what Anastasia Vassilieva told me in her interview, that their goal is very simple: to get back these funds, to get back this money, this wealth back to the Russian people, instead of investing it into this invisible hybrid war that Putin is carrying on against us, against our democracies.
Well, that's a very good point, because you're going to, if you could stay with us, Zarina, and we're going to have Q&A after the show. We can ask Zarina anything you like about Russia and why she's designated a terrorist. But you have to sign up to Patreon/Byline TV or on YouTube. But on the issue of democracy, we should be joined now by Tom Brake. Tom, are you there? Hello. We almost sorted out all our sound issues. And can you hear me?
Indeed, I am unmuted and I can hear you loud and clear, Peter.
Oh, fantastic. Can I blame you for that technical problem then? Good. It's probably our end. Tom, I don't know if you've heard our conversation with Zarina Zabrisky, but she makes the point, all the repressions that are going on in Belarus and in Russia. We just had an interview with Navalny's doctor, who is under some form of house arrest and herself facing prison for visiting Navalny during the hunger strike. She makes the point that this is international now, these threats to democracy, and that there was a Belarusian died in suspicious circumstances in Ukraine, is that it's on our streets too, obviously, with the Novichok attack in Salisbury, the Polonian attack in London. Do you see some of these threats from abroad, from, if you like, kleptocracies and oligarchies coming here? And if so, what can we do to stop it?
Well, yes, I do. But I think first we should look across the pond at the US, of course, where the US came very close to losing its democracy as a result of Trump's actions. So I don't think there's any reason for us to be complacent in the UK. In relation to Russia, one issue that the UK has had for many years, of course, is that many of the Russian oligarchs who made lots of money during that period after the fall of the Soviet Union ended up relocating themselves to the United Kingdom, bringing with them large amounts of money, the source of which is probably not particularly clear. And there are significant concerns that they have managed to, in effect, infiltrate British society through house purchases, legal ways, through purchasing clubs and so on. And that is something which is now part of British society. And
just on that, Tom, just so people don't know, this great author, Catherine Belton, used to be at, she's at Reuters now, wrote a fantastic book on Putin's people, the oligarchs coming to the UK, particularly the UK, and she's being sued in the British court by 3 or 4 of those oligarchs, and billions is going to lawyers in this defamation suit. So it affects our legal system too, doesn't it?
It does, and I mean, I could reach out with my left arm and reach her book, which is on my shelf just beside me, and a fantastic book it is. But what it does highlight is that that money has infiltrated throughout the West, including the United Kingdom. In terms of other things that Putin is doing, which, well, I don't want to exaggerate the extent to which Putin's activities are reflected in the UK, but one issue that does concern me is the issue of rampant cronyism that exists in Putin's Russia, in terms of him placing people in all positions of power and deriving money from those sources. Our present government hasn't exactly conducted themselves with due propriety, I would argue, in relation to, for instance, the way PPE contracts have been allocated, the way, for instance, that the Towns Fund, government money, has been used to reward principally conservative marginal seats. Now, that cronyism is very unhealthy.
Well, we've written, as you know, about the Towns Fund, Port Barrel and PPE contracts for at least a year. And there is that model. I mean, who are the biggest donors to the Conservative Party? One of the biggest donors. Quite a few of them are Russian. So you're, in a way, saying the model that happened in post-Soviet Russia of people putting their legs under the table of the state, taking over state interests, is in a way become a model for British politicians who are close to those very same Russian oligarchs, yes?
Well, certainly what I'm saying is that, I mean, some of those oligarchs now, of course, are British citizens, but we need to look carefully at the transparency and accountability around these donations. So, for instance, Mr. Tomeko, who is now a British citizen, his company has made, and this is all public, it's not a secret, has made donations to a number of Conservative members of Parliament in promoting the business that he represents. Well, apparently, according to Grant Shapps, businesses donate large amounts of money to the Conservative Party and don't expect anything in return. But I think most people will find that rather strange. And actually, when businessmen are making donations to principally the Conservative Party, they expect not just to get the ear of the MP or the minister, but they're probably trying to extract something from a policy perspective from them as well. And the Conservative Advisory Board, which has got some coverage in the last couple of days, is a good example of that, a rather opaque arrangement whereby people who apparently contribute £250,000 to the Conservatives get to have the ear of the Prime Minister. We need to know who is it exactly who's part of this board, what are they raising with the Prime Minister, so that we can see whether in fact they're just happy to listen to the Prime Minister talk about his summer holidays, or whether in fact what they're doing is encouraging the Prime Minister to push their policies in government, because it is to their business interests if he does that.
And just to make that point, absolutely, it's not former Ukrainian, former Russian oligarchs doing that. There's a famous case of Robert Jenrick meeting up with Richard Desmond, the former proprietor of the Express. So it's certainly not justification of foreigners doing this. Hardeep, you had something to say.
Indeed.
I was going to ask you, Tom. It's often been said that British democracy is quite vulnerable because we just think it could never happen to us. Like Zarina was saying on our show earlier, we're not like Russia. We're not like some of these countries in Europe which are descending into authoritarianism. Why do you think it is so difficult for people to get their heads around this concept that here in Britain, the threat to democracy is every bit as serious as the ones that we've been discussing?
Well, I mentioned the US earlier. The US went from being a stable democracy, and after 4 years, it came very close to turning into a fascist dictatorship. That happened within the space of 4 years. The reason that the organization I'm director of, Unlock Democracy, campaigns for a written constitution, I was disappointed to hear Gavin say that the constitutional matters are very boring, but actually a written constitution, of course, is something that would lock in rights and values and principles which any prime minister could not then overturn on the basis of a simple majority in parliament, which currently, of course, is the case.
Well, Tom, you should write for Byline Times expressing that. We've had a lot of constitutional issues. I'm sure the way you write about it will make it not seem boring. So thanks very much for joining us tonight on Friday Night with Byline Times. And do join us again and do write something for us. That's a commission.
Thank you. I will take that up.
So we are now finished with our live show, but we still have the wonderful Zarina with us, who's here, top secret, to answer all those tricky spy questions after the break. But only if you sponsor us, only if you sign up. I'm sorry, we do need to pay for all this expensive kit. And when the sound goes, get new stuff. So do join us if you can. In about 5 minutes, well, all three of us be here with George and Caden after the break.
And we also have our magazine, which we've renamed. So it started off as the Byline TV Guide, but we've actually given it a bit of a reboot to bring it more in line with the Byline brand. So it's now called the Byline TV Times, and you can get that weekly for just about 70 pence, and it'll give you lots of information about behind the scenes insights from our producers and what's coming up as well. So do sign up, because as Peter said, it's another way for us to make all of this possible and to improve the sound, which I'm hoping has been a lot better again this week. But if it's not, I know you'll tell us, because we're your TV station. So thanks very much for joining us, and for those not joining the Q&A, we'll see you all next week.
And don't get disheartened or discombobulated. Thank you.
This is